interested in your community, I am more than happy for you to have you reach out to me, and I will help you get that process started. We do have a very small alliance here in Richland County, Illinois, which is Olney, Illinois. And we have done a couple of things with that. And I'll talk about some of those things at the very end of this presentation, just to give you an idea what a community alliance might look like and what they might do in your community if you would decide you want to start one. First, let's define what drug endangered children are. These are children who are at risk of both physical and emotional harm due to the fact that their parent or their caregiver is using drugs. They may be using, they may have them in their possession, they might be manufacturing them, they might be cultivating them, or they may simply be selling those drugs. This puts the children in that home in a very, very tight situation that is extremely dangerous for them. We'll talk about some of the more in-depth pieces of that. These are also children that the parents are doing any of the myriad of things that I've just mentioned, but more importantly, the use of those drugs, the misuse of those drugs, because it might be a legal prescription that that parent has, but the misuse of those drugs interferes with that parent or that caregiver's ability to basically parent correctly and safely. We all know children that are living in that type of situation, or we've been exposed to families that have this going on and know how very scary it is to watch. These particular children that are involved in this situation are 3 times more likely to be verbally, physically, and sexually abused. We'll talk a little more in depth about that. These children are also 4 times more likely than other children to be neglected. And neglect is a key word here, because neglect is usually the first thing that identifies these children. It's not necessarily sexual abuse or being beaten. It's typically neglect. And that's a key word to keep in mind throughout this presentation, because that's our first line when we're looking at identifying these kids. So if we're going to look at neglect, we need to know what the Illinois definition of neglect is. This is out of DCFS. In Illinois specifically, neglect is defined as the failure of a parent or a caregiver to meet minimal parenting standards. And those minimal parenting standards include, are they providing proper supervision, food, clothing, taking them to the doctor, giving them medical care, shelter? Do they have adequate housing, as well as other very basic needs? Now, if you're looking at this definition and thinking, let's flesh out minimal parenting standards. What does that mean? Well, that's up for debate. That's going to be very dependent on the caseworker's interpretation of that. There is not really very specific things given for that particular statement. That makes it very difficult, and it leaves it very subjective when we call and make a report to DCFS for that caseworker to go in and take a look at what's going on. They can define that in a lot of different ways. I always give the example of a case where we had a child that we had a family of children, several children coming into school that had bite marks all over their body. And somebody reported it. The caseworker went into the home and found rats in that home that were the size of small cats. And that at nighttime, they were, of course, crawling around on the kids and they were biting them. And the caseworker gave the family, the caregivers, a week to decide what they were going to do to rectify this situation. They did not pull the children out of the home at that point, but they gave the family a week to decide how to rectify the situation. And when the caseworker went back into the home a week later, the family said, we have fixed the problem, and they had gotten a cat. It was a 6-week-old kitten. So the rats were bigger than the kitten. But according to that particular case manager's subjective view of this definition of neglect, they went ahead and said that they closed the case and said that the situation had been properly rectified. So that's one of those worst case scenarios, but I like to put it out there just to give some perspective. Also understand that every state in the United States has a different definition of neglect. This is just Illinois' definition. So they don't cross state lines. It's going to look a little bit different each time. Okay. Something I want you to keep in the back of your mind as we talk about all of this is that numbers are starting to truly come out and show that children living in rural areas are twice as likely as urban children to suffer from maltreatment. I don't like to point fingers because I think all children, whether they are urban or they are rural, are in danger when they're living in a drug endangered home. However, rural children are more easily hidden because they may live on a piece of property deep in the woods, in a trailer or a small home, whatever, and nobody sees what's going on. There are less eyes on the situation. We also know that in rural areas, the resources for help are much, much, much less. And I think that's why those numbers are showing what they're showing, that rural children are more likely to suffer from maltreatment. But I don't want to undermine the fact that urban children also suffer from maltreatment due to this situation. That's an absolute given. I don't want to undermine that. Now, as we move forward, I want to give us a working one definition for what addiction is. And for those of you who work in the substance use disorder field or behavioral health treatment, mental health treatment, you're going to see that word addiction and think, oh my goodness, that's not the proper terminology. And I do use that terminology interchangeably with substance use disorder for one reason in particular. I work with multiple people that are in recovery from addiction. And when I use the word substance use disorder or SUD or substance misuse, they all look at me and laugh and say, let's just call it like it is, Liesl, this is addiction. I am an addict. So in deference to them, I am going to use that term interchangeably, not to offend anybody, but just simply because those who are living it have asked me to use that word appropriately. So the definition of addiction is defined as a chronic relapsing disorder, causes people to compulsively drug seek, regardless of the consequences. It causes long-lasting changes in the brain, not necessarily permanent changes, but long-lasting. The worst part of addiction is not just that it's chronic, meaning that it goes on for a really long time, if not all the time, and can reoccur pretty quickly, which is the relapsing part of it. It is both a complex brain disorder and a mental illness. Now, if we compare this to something like cancer, and I'm not saying cancer is better. What I am saying is that we have more resources in the medical field to deal with cancer. We have cancers that we know that we can cure. We have a way to do that. Not all cancers, not by any stretch of the imagination, nor am I saying that treatment for cancer is an easy thing. Absolutely not. But when we compare medical conditions, a complex brain disorder in conjunction with a mental illness is very, very, very difficult to get on top of and to treat. We have very few tools in our toolbox to treat addiction. We are still in the very early learning stages of this. So folks that suffer with this, we need to give some grace because there's just not a lot out there. And there is a wide array of theories of what's going to work. I have some people that say, well, you can cure addiction by just walking away from it. Well, I had somebody, a physician tell me who works in addiction medicine, tell me that being an addict, the brain of somebody living in addiction is kind of comparable to somebody that has gone without food and water for 2 weeks. And if you go without food and water for 2 weeks, your body, your whole self, every piece of your brain and yourself is going to be crying out for food and water, and is going to go after food and water. You're going to do whatever it takes to put food and water in your system. An addict's brain works the same way, but it's with drugs, and they can't always control it. So there's that complex brain disorder, and there's that mental illness, because it is very frustrating to try and get out of this. Please keep those things in mind when I'm talking about these folks. When we talk about addiction, there's a lot of discussion as to whether or not it's caused by nature versus nurture. We all know that it's probably both. Yes, we have folks that have a genetic predisposition toward addiction. Their brains are just pre-wired to slip into that in a very easy and quick way. There may be other biological factors that play into that. And from a nurture standpoint, we know that people that grow up in a drug home have been nurtured, if you will, toward using drugs. So they've been exposed to it, their life experiences and all of their learning pieces blend into that brain and cause them to potentially go after that. But for most people, it's a piece of both. We all know those families that really good families, there was never an issue with this kind of thing, and then one of their young people slips into addiction and overdoses and passes away. And that's going to be a completely different situation. And we're seeing that more and more. But in general, addiction is both nature and nurture driven. When we look at prenatal risks, so these are babies that are not born yet, and all the pieces that go with this. How difficult is it to isolate those prenatal risks and nail it right down to addiction of that particular birth mother? It's very difficult to do. Some of the things we look at, and these are just pictures, snapshots of what's going on with the effects of prenatal drug exposure. We know a lot of these mamas do not get good prenatal care. Maybe not from a lack of resources. Maybe they have access to prenatal care. But for those of you who have carried a pregnancy, and you remember what's the first thing you do when you walk into the doctor, the OBGYN's office, you pee in a cup. And that is a very triggering thing for somebody that is living in addiction, to pee in a cup, because that's our most common way of doing a drug test. So this mother is pregnant. She comes into the doctor's office, and oh my goodness, they ask her to pee in a cup. First thing she's going to do is think, I don't want to do this. Might make a million excuses. I can't pee. I peed before I got in here. There's a million things. But generally speaking, what we see with those moms is they don't come back to the doctor, or they come back so infrequently that we can't catch things that might be going wrong at an early stage, where maybe we could begin to fix and heal some of those things. So these moms get very poor prenatal care. They typically don't eat very well. If they are using during their pregnancy, they're going to choose to use before they choose to eat. And I've had some wonderful, well-meaning folks look at me and say, well, there's no excuse for that, because WIC provides, food they can get. Well, it does. WIC does provide food. However, that food can be sold to the next door neighbor or to a good friend so that they have money for drugs. And that, again, that's driven by that need in the brain, regardless of the harmful consequences, to not do what they're supposed to be doing, which is to not eat very well. When people don't get good prenatal care and they don't have good nutrition, these babies are often born prematurely. That's a problem. We know head circumference drives how the brain is going to develop. We know that lungs are underdeveloped with premature babies. That's just some of the very basic stuff. Premature babies have a much higher risk for ADHD. They have a much higher risk for becoming ill. So RSV, we can go down that list. It puts them at a really high risk, all because we can kind of drive that back to prenatal drug exposure. The connection is there. We also know, if you think about it, when a new mama is handed their baby, all wrapped up in the pretty pink or the blue blanket, and they're all clean and they're safe in that hospital environment, that baby is going to be going home with that mom, and that mom is going to be walking right back into the same environment that she walked out of when she went into labor. And so it's what we call an adverse postnatal environment. If the home wasn't clean before, it's not going to be clean now. If that home has drug paraphernalia laying around, it still has drug paraphernalia laying around. Nothing has changed about that postnatal environment, and it's still not a good situation, no matter how much we want to dress that baby up in the hospital and think as they walk out the door with their new family that everything's going to be okay and it's just randomly going to fix itself. It doesn't work that way. Now, when we look at prenatal risk, we look at several things. What substance is being used? There's a difference between a puff of marijuana and using meth on a daily basis several times a day for your entire pregnancy. So we look at what substance is being used. How often is it being used? How long is it being used? How much is it being used? All those things are going to come into play when we look at how much prenatal risk is involved with these babies, with these children. And those are questions that medical personnel need to ask. Or if you are a substance use disorder counselor, those are questions that you are already asking, but it's going to drive some of the latent effects of drug exposure prenatally when we see these babies after they're born. And that, I think that's all common knowledge. This is some of the things that, this is thinking out of the box just a little bit, but what are some of the risks after these kiddos come home from the hospital? So I don't know if you've ever been in a drug home or you've been in what they call a trap house. Environmental chaos is a polite way of saying that house is a complete disaster. It is filthy, dirty dishes in the sink, roaches crawling everywhere. It is a wreck. It is, there may not be sheets on the bed. There may not be curtains at the windows. There may not be heat or air conditioning or running water because the bills aren't getting paid. But typically somebody who is living in a drug situation and using drugs doesn't think much about cleaning things up. I was in a home that was being cleaned after somebody went to rehab, had been arrested and went to rehab. And in that home, you know, on the surface of things, it looked sort of clean, but it had this funky smell. And as we began moving furniture away from the walls, I can't even begin to tell you the filth that was sitting underneath and behind and over, and it was unreal. It was absolutely unreal. Now, when I do this presentation for a longer seminar, several hours, I have video that is live video, if you will, that was shot that shows some of these things, but the video typically doesn't work very well when I do a Zoom presentation. But the pictures are astounding. They are absolutely astounding. We know that when these kids get home, there is a terrible lack of supervision. And if you think about school nights, you know, we usually have our kids in bed by 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, if you're really struggling. These are the kids that are out running around wherever in the neighborhood, on the county roads or downtown, whatever. They're out at 11 or 12 at night because nobody's paying attention. Mom, dad, caregivers may be completely knotted out in the house, and these kids get out and go do whatever, and they may only be 5 years old. It is not uncommon to see that, but lack of supervision puts these kids in serious danger. I know I wouldn't let my 17-year-old daughter to be out running around at midnight, and she's pretty responsible. But I think of all the bad things that could be happening. And if a 5-year-old is out running around, that lack of supervision is pretty scary stuff. Lack of necessities. And by necessities, I talk about there's no money in the house for toilet paper. Have you tried to go to the bathroom and have a bowel movement and you have no toilet paper? That's just one example. Lack of necessities might be food. Money gets used for drugs before it gets used for food. We go into a drug home, we open the refrigerator, and there may be a moldy pizza from last week, and that may be all that's in the refrigerator. So these kids aren't eating. They may not have soap, shampoo. They may not have basic clothing items. They may not have a bed. They may be sleeping on a hard floor with no blanket, no pillow, whatever. We know that these children are very, very heavily exposed to violence. There are several drugs that are out there that cause people to be very, very violent, bath salts being one of them. Meth can be one of those big culprits. We hear those stories of people that just go completely bonkers, completely off their rocker when they are using large amounts of these drugs. And there's other drugs too. Those are just a couple of examples. But violence is a huge piece of what these kids witness, and it becomes very commonplace for them. And then our poor school systems are the ones that these kids come to them 9 months out of the year, 8 hours a day, 7, 8 hours a day, and the schools are having to deal with the after effects of this. This is what these kids see on a daily or an evening basis. An overlay death is a death that is caused by a parent or a caregiver falling asleep and rolling over on a child and smothering them. We've heard about this for years, but the numbers for overlay deaths are almost unequivocally tied into somebody who is either very sick and has put their baby in bed with them, or people that are using drugs. Because if you've ever tried to wake somebody up who's been using, it's very difficult. And so they don't have that same sense of waking up when they roll over on their child. Those of us who maybe have a little person that sleeps with us now and then, we kind of sleep with one eye open. That's just how we do it. But when you're using drugs, that doesn't happen. So these kids are at risk for an overlay death. Loss. These kids experience loss in ways that I can't even begin to explain. I'm going to give you a few examples. These kids might have Christmas presents, and then mom, dad, caregivers, whatever, they let them play with them for a day, maybe an hour, and then they put them back in the box, tape them up, and they take them back to Walmart and sell them back so they can get money for drugs. And I've heard some wonderful folks say, oh, we have a system in place that people can't do that. Folks that are living in addiction are very, very crafty, very creative. So it might be your local Walmart won't take that toy back, but I guarantee 1-2 counties over probably will take it back. And they'll go to great lengths to get money for their drugs. And so that child thought they had a new baby doll to play with, or a new tricycle, or a new game, and they wake up the next morning and it's gone. Another example of loss, these families move often, mostly because they're not able to pay their rent, or they're trying to escape the police in some way, shape, or form. And so these kids might be picked up in the middle of the night, thrown in the car with whatever clothes they have on, and moved. They don't take their favorite teddy bear with them. They don't get to take their shoes with them. They don't get to their favorite toys, whatever. They don't have those things. It's just another mode of loss that these kids experience. On a greater scale, if you think about a parent that overdoses and dies, and that child wakes up in the morning and finds their parent dead. We had a case just a few counties over. It's been a couple of years ago, and the two little people in the house woke up, and both mom and dad had overdosed and were laying on the living room floor dead. And that, yes, on the surface of things, you think, well, they're probably better off wherever they are. Not necessarily. These kids experience loss emotionally as well as physically, and on a lot of different levels. Ingestion and exposure, of course, that is when a child either eats a drug or is exposed to it in such a way that it makes them sick. Most often, it's not because a parent is feeding a child drugs. Most often, it is drugs that maybe fall on the floor while mom and dad are racking it up or using it. Even just a dusting of fentanyl, just a bare dusting of fentanyl will kill an adult. So you can imagine if a 9-month-old is crawling around on the floor and gets that on their hands and then puts their hands on their face, or they touch a toy and they put that toy in their mouth. That's where the ingestion and exposure is typically coming from. It's rare that we see a parent or a caregiver that, is really purposefully feeding drugs to a child to make them sick. It happens. It absolutely does happen, but that's not the most common thing that we see. One of the last postnatal risks that we're going to go into a little more depth, is human and sex trafficking. Specifically, I'm going to talk about family trafficking. If you've not been exposed to that, we're going to talk a little more in depth about it. But these kids are very much at risk for that particular practice. Children that grow up in drug environments, the long-term effects, we all know these: emotional problems, behavioral problems, cognitive problems. We can probably name a child that we know who has been stuck in this horrible cycle of dealing with this kind of thing. The emotional problems come from a complex array of issues, anxiety probably being the biggest one. Am I going to have food to eat today? Is mom going to be awake? Is grandma going to be able to go to the store and pick up the things I need for my school project tomorrow? PTSD from with these kids is pretty common, whether it is the police showing up at the door and dragging mom or dad out of the house, or whether it is waking up in the morning and finding mom passed out on the floor, not breathing, and that child happens to know how to use Narcan and has to give Narcan and decide, do I call the police? Do I call for help? What do I do? Behavioral problems. We see a lot of, and I just put this very simply, dysfunctional situations that the kids are exposed to, and then they turn around and act it out. Pornography, watching very, very inappropriate TV shows, if the TV is actually working and they have cable, or being on the computer with that goes back to your no supervision. But these kids act out what they see. So there's our behavioral problems. And that's just touching the surface. We are just touching the surface of long-term effects. Cognitive problems, and this one, we know the typical ones. These kids have trouble paying attention. They're at a high risk for ADHD. They may be learning delayed in some way. They may have a learning disability. But one of the things that really starts very, very early on is the inability for a child to be able to pick up on social cues. From the day that we're born, we are taught just by living in our families how to pick up on basic social cues. A family that doesn't function appropriately and doesn't have aware and involved grown-ups in the home can't teach that child those things. And we just sort of innately teach that to our children. By the time they hit school age, and they don't know how to pick up on those cues, they don't know when to tell that somebody is getting angry with them or is frustrated because that child is demanding a lot of attention. They can't pick up on those things. And you can see how that would just spiral and domino effect itself right into all these other labels that we typically put on kids, when initially it really comes out to they did not learn appropriate ways to pick up on social cues. We have a 17-year-old daughter that we adopted from China. We adopted her when she was 2.5. And one of the things that is very different, she came to our country at 2.5 with no English language. We had no background, very little background on her. But one of the things we noticed very early on was difficulty in learning how to pick up social cues. Well, she moved from one culture, completely different, to another culture. And it's taken a long time for her to learn how to do those things. She knows how to hide it well. She functions, she's an incredible young lady. But that social cue piece is really a key component to a child's development. So I don't want you to kind of brush that off and think that that's nothing, because it feeds into everything that we do every single day. These are long-term effects: emotional, behavioral, cognitive. I work a lot within the judicial system, within the drug courts, as well as working with juvenile divisions and helping them to tackle some of the issues that they're seeing. And one of the things we see in judicial sectors is this emerging adult population, which is ages 18 to 24-ish, that don't have social skills. They don't know how to think things through. We've got a lot of anxiety, depression, PTSD, complex emotions that they don't know how to name. They came out, if they stuck it out in school, serious behavioral problems, cognitive issues. But one of the things I hear almost consistently is that inability to be socially functional. And that goes back to social cues. So these are kids that most likely came up in a drug endangered situation. I would just about bet if we ran some research on that, we would find that those are pieces of what we're seeing now, and we're seeing them on the adult sector. That's just part of the growth process. So just something to think about, long-term effects. Some of the other dangers, we know that in these homes, home invasion is huge. If a drug dealer hasn't gotten their money and they want their money, they might very well break into that home and start stealing, beating, throwing things around. These kids are very, very able to see and watch that, and how terrifying for them if at 3 a.m. some guy comes barreling into their room, throwing things around and terrifying them. Home invasion is very real. It's just not something that gets reported because people aren't going to call the police and say, hey, my drug dealer came looking for money and they broke into my house. And yeah, that's just going to set up a whole issue with law enforcement. So they don't report that. Children are abducted and used for ransom. Once again, these families don't report that, because when they report that, the law enforcement is pretty adept at digging down deep into the problem to find out why that child was abducted and what is the ransom actually for. So when you hear a child maybe say something that might trigger a thought in your mind and you remember this, you might ask a few more questions. See if those kids are willing to talk about that. But we don't see that reported, at least very rarely do we see that reported, because it's going to domino effect right into that family being looked at for illegal drug activity. We know that people transport drugs in kids' items. You've all heard about, filling the diaper, or seen it on TV, that people put drugs in the baby's diaper. They put them, they hide them. They're very creative, hiding it in diaper bags, in car seats, inside a stuffed animal, taking out the stitching of a stuffed animal and putting the drugs in there and stitching it back up. We see those things. And we're putting those kids at incredible risk when we do that, especially our smallest ones who don't know any better. Everything goes in their mouth. How terrifying. Children are often brought to a drug buy. So mom or dad goes to buy their drugs and they take that kiddo right with them. No problem. In the car, in the house where the drugs are, whatever. They sit and visit, do whatever. Children are also used as decoys. It's not uncommon for a 5-year-old to be told to go stand on the street corner while drugs are being done in that house, and they have a cell phone and they push a button. They're told to push a button if they see a cop car come through. So those are dangerous situations for these kids. This is not a happy time for them. Some of the basic stats are that 9 million children in the United States live with at least one parent who suffers from substance use disorder. It's the 1 in 4 children under the age of 18 that are touched by parental addiction that gets me. That's 25% of our kids. So if you are in the school system, if you are a teacher or a school nurse, and you walk into a classroom and there's 20 kids in a classroom, you can bet that 5 of them are living in a situation where there's parental addiction is involved. And this is not always, we tend to think, oh, those are the dirty kids, those are the low income families. Not so much, not always. It's not uncommon for there to be wealthier families that are fighting this same battle. They just have the means and the resources to hide it a little bit better. So keep that in mind. Now, I touched on the human trafficking and said that the very same kids who are living in these drug endangered homes oftentimes are at risk for what we call family facilitated human trafficking. Forgive me, my throat's getting scratchy. Family facilitated human trafficking is a little bit different than what we think of when we think of human trafficking. And keep in mind, again, kids who are living in a drug home are at very high risk for this type of trafficking. When we think of trafficking, we look at all these different kinds. We've got older kids that might traffic themselves because they have no place to live, no money. So they might turn a trick just so that they can have money to go to McDonald's or go to the football game Friday night, whatever. Or they're living on the street and it helps them to buy a blanket, that they can wrap up in. The other types of human trafficking, whether it's pimp driven, gang driven, organized crime, those are the things we think of when we think of human trafficking. We think of kids being abducted and sold across state lines. And, with the movie coming out that came out this summer, the Tim Ballard movie makes us really think a lot about this, but there's kind of a dirty little secret going on when it comes to family or human trafficking, and it's what we call family facilitated trafficking. This is trafficking that actually happens within the home, and it is generally put forth by the parent or the caregiver selling up their child in the home for sex. So the general definition of child human trafficking is recruiting, harboring, transporting, providing, obtaining, patronizing, or soliciting a child for commercial sex. That can involve pornography. It can involve prostitution. All of those things apply here. But when we start to look at family trafficking, this is when a family member gives an offender access to a child in exchange for something of value. Drugs are the number one reason that we see family trafficking. And family trafficking is generally, as I said, done within the home. It is extremely wicked, not that the others aren't, but when it comes to healing processes for these children who have been family trafficked, it's a whole nother level of trauma, a whole nother level of healing that we don't really have a lot of systems in place for. We're going to talk a little more about that. Just some stats, and I'm going to zip through these. The majority of victims in terms of child trafficking, that trafficking starts in the home, most often by the mother. Okay. And the reason for that, you're seeing the number 65% by the mother, 32% by the father. The mother is typically the one that has custody of the children. Now, these stats are old. I would like to see some new stats because I think some of that is probably going to change. We're seeing more and more fathers get custody of their children. So I would expect some of these statistics to change just a little bit. We know that a little less than 85% of family trafficking involves illegal drugs. They see that child as a commodity. I can sell that child and, I can sell them 4 or 5 times of an evening. They can go to work for me. And then I can, by 2 a.m., I can go and buy my drugs, or by 6 a.m., I can go buy my drugs. A lot of these children have a history with the child welfare system, but it's not necessarily for sexual abuse. It is typically flagged for neglect. Okay. These kids work all night, or they work quite a bit. So they're going to not be so prone to want to get up in the morning and go to school. If you think about it, their body hurts because they have been trafficked to adults, typically adults, and their body hurts, and coming to sit in school all day is not going to be very comfortable. They may not be clean. They haven't had a bath. They haven't had anything to eat. They're tired. They're exhausted. And so there's your signs of neglect. And so that's why neglect is a key word here. That's going to be the first thing that gets turned in, not so much the sexual abuse part of it. Most often in these families, this is a way of life. This is what grandma was sold into. Mom did the same, and now we're doing the same for our daughter or our son. Boys are also very much involved in this. These children are less likely to run away, except when they get older and they're a little more capable. A 5-year-old can't really easily run away from something like this. A 15-year-old might have a little more access to run away and go couch surf on, on some friends' couches to try and keep themselves safe. Most often, these children do not have substance abuse issues themselves. A lot of times that comes later if we've not been able to get them out of the home or give them some type of treatment to help with this trauma. These kids miss a lot of school. They miss a lot of school. They struggle with school. There's your learning disabilities. There's your PTSD. There's your anxiety. There's missing on social cues. There's all those pieces that come into fruition when we talk about not making it to school or struggling in school. Obviously, the caregiver has a substance misuse issue, or they wouldn't be doing this. I brought this, it says victims often as young as 4 years old. I will tell you that I have had a couple of cases of infants as young as 6, 7, 8 months old that have been trafficked. And obviously they can't get away from it. They're babies, to say the very least. As I said, mother is most often the trafficker. If there is a second trafficker, of which there oftentimes is, a lot of times it is a boyfriend. And so as you guys are working with your children, whether they're in your organization or in your school or in the hospital, listen to what the children are telling you. If mom is a single mom and she suddenly has a new boyfriend and all of a sudden this child is missing school, they're showing up dirty, they're tired, they're hungry, we need to start asking some questions. And there's that comment again, child welfare involvement typically begins with neglect. The people that typically pick this up, of course, are going to be foster care parents as they listen to those children talk, but law enforcement is typically involved. Medical personnel, if the child is taken to the doctor for any reason, also might have eyes on that situation. It's not as common that child welfare is looking for this kind of thing. Again, this is kind of a new idea. We know it goes around. We know it's happening. Anytime I do a very public training on this, I always have law enforcement officers in that room. And when I ask them if they have, how many of them have walked in a home where they suspected the child was being trafficked, almost everyone without a fail will raise their hand. And when I ask the next question of, were you able to see proof of that? Did you have any reason that would give you to pull that child out of the home? Without fail, nobody has a hand up. It's very easy to hide, with a few exceptions. And so they can get away with it with this. It's a money-making adventure for them. Now, I want to clarify and say that not every person, not every adult that is involved in drugs participates in this. Not everyone. We just know that there's an intersection with illegal drug use and family human trafficking. It's something we need to keep our eyes open for. It's out there way more than we realize. These children may or may not go to the doctor. Mom and dad, caregivers don't want to take them to the doctor unless they have to. And so usually when they get to the doctor, it's really bad. Okay, it's really, really bad. And it may be some kind of way out there complaints, really severe stomach ache, throwing up. Well, there's your anxiety, or it could be internal damage depending on what's going on. But usually it's not until it gets really bad that they will take them to the doctor. These kids obviously are going to experience and witness domestic violence, because many people that patronize that type of trafficking like that violent piece. So a higher likelihood of polyvictimization, meaning these kids might be sexually abused, physically abused, emotionally, you name it. They're going to get it all, because that's what's happening in that bedroom. These families typically move and relocate often. They can't pay their bills, or somebody is on to them, and so they pick up and move. There's your loss. This child may have made a friend at school, might start trusting a teacher enough that they might say something, and boom, they're gone. They get moved and they relocate. And so we also know that children that have to change schools frequently obviously don't get the learning abilities well established, and that puts them at risk again. And as I've already said, DCFS might identify these kids, but typically it's going to be medical community or school personnel. So keep your eyes open. And I just went back. These children, what is unique here is that they don't have a choice. They're living, this is happening in the family home. We're taught to respect our parents. These kids are threatened, they're bribed, mom can't get her medicine. She's going to be very sick if you don't go to work tonight. Or we're not going to eat unless you go to work tonight, or you meet up with Uncle Jerry for a couple of hours this evening. It's very, very difficult to usurp that parental authority. And occasionally, yes, weapons are involved, but it doesn't usually take much with our younger kids. That physical force and that parental authority. Our 5-year-olds typically aren't allowed to just walk out down the street and go to the police station and make a report. That doesn't happen very often. So this is a unique thing. These kids don't really have a choice. Now, as you're thinking through some of the things that I've said, I want you to think about, why would this be more common in rural areas, and is it easier to hide? And what do these kids look like? How do I spot them? I want to give you a case scenario of a case that I worked with a long while ago. Had a young lady who was 6th or 7th grade, early middle school, and not even in this state. So if you're trying to put your brain together and think about who I'm talking about, you're not going to know. But this young lady was pregnant. Nobody knew. She hid the pregnancy until she was probably about 9 months pregnant. The school nurse noticed that she was wearing really baggy clothes and could tell that she was pregnant. This young lady was maybe 80 pounds, dripping wet. She was a very, very tiny young woman. And I got called into the situation because at the time I was working with teen pregnancy, came in to do some childbirth classes. And in talking with her, what we found out is that they lived in a very remote area of a very rural community. And their home was situated so that it was very isolated, if you will, which is really common. People move out to the country so they can have their own space. But mom and dad worked nights, and older brother, who was in high school, was trafficking his younger sister to his friends for drug money. She did not have the knowledge to know really what was going on, only that she didn't feel good, and ultimately was 9 months pregnant and delivered a baby just a few weeks after we began working with her. That's a rural area, very easy to hide. And it was probably my first exposure to what was going on. We didn't even have terminology for this. This would have been about 20 some years ago. And we didn't even have terminology for this. I also want to say that I spoke in front of the Illinois Human Trafficking Task Force here. It's been a few months ago. And this type of trafficking is it wasn't even on their radar. We don't have laws that specifically apply to this as of yet. We can find ways to prosecute, but there's nothing specific to family human trafficking. So just a couple of things to keep in your mind. What do these kids look like? What am I looking for? We've already talked about most of this. They're going to be involved with child welfare probably early on for neglect. They're missing school. They're going to have odd injuries. Anybody who has taken any kind of classes on child abuse and how to spot that, those red flags are going to go off in your mind. Emergency room doctor visits are going to be either sporadic or they're going to be odd, and it's going to raise a red flag. These kids their mood, their behavior, their appearance might change overnight. And that's where I would ask, how are mom and dad doing? Who'd you stay with last night? And if, somebody indicates got a new boyfriend, new girlfriend, mom or dad, I think I would be asking some questions as to what's going on there. These kids might run away from home, but typically they're going to be older. Of course, if they turn up with a sexually transmitted infection, our red flags go up right away. Suicide, self-harm, we're seeing that with younger and younger kids, and almost without fail, not all of them, but I would say probably 75% have somewhere along the way been involved with some type of sexual abuse, causing them to be suicidal or self-harm. PTSD in a young child can be caused by a lot of different things, but if you're asking the right questions, those bells are going to go off in your head that this is something that we maybe need to look a little deeper into. Now, the kicker is this is happening. This trauma emanates from the home where they're supposed to be able to trust and run to for safety. They love their parents because that's what we're taught to do. When it comes to treating these kids, you know, typically if somebody's been trafficked, if they've been abducted and they've been trafficked against state lines, we want to bring them home to mom and dad. That's not the case here. These kids can never go back into that family. And that sets up for a whole nother level of trauma, a whole nother level of scary stuff. We do not have appropriate services in place enough in full to treat these kids. We do the best we can, but it's really hard. You know, when we place a child in foster care, the first people we look at are family members. Can't do that in this case. We need to get them out of that family. We need to get them out of that home. So we're completely uprooting their life. Yes, for the better, but it is still very difficult. It is a unique type of trauma caused by a family that these children are going to be dealing with for the rest of their lives. So everybody plays a part here. When you start to look at maybe developing a community alliance, you need all these different sectors of the community at the table, all for very obvious reasons: medical, drug treatment, education, judicial, child protective services, law enforcement. Everybody needs to be at the table talking about this and trying to come up with some new things to do. What do we do as an alliance? We can't arrest somebody, but we can sure report them. We can't fix the problem right off the bat, but we can make it a little easier. We can transition the help meets. So we have, I have counties that have something called Handle with Care that their community alliances developed, and that's working in tandem with the school system, where a child has maybe been removed from the home in the middle of the night because of drugs, whatever. And how this works is somebody makes that report to the school and says, handle Johnny Smith with care. And the school then gets online and looks at all the people in the school that are going to be touching little Johnny's life that morning, that day. And they send out an email with no details, but just handle Johnny Smith with care today. And then that triggers all these services that we need to look for. Does he need clean clothes? Did he have breakfast? Does he need to sleep? Did he get moved to a foster family? Did he spend the night in the hospital? All those things. So Handle with Care just puts the tools in the teachers and the school officials' hands to perhaps treat that child with a little more grace rather than looking at the behavior and thinking, what a pain in the rear this kid is. There's usually a reason. Backpacks. We have the food backpacks that go home over the weekend, but these are backpacks that are age appropriate, that maybe law enforcement might carry or keep in their facility, and they know they're going to a drug home, that they're going to make a raid. We're going to pull a child out who's 3 years old. They can grab a backpack that has 3-year-old stuff in it, a sippy cup, maybe some diapers or pull-ups, a new pair of jammies, a stuffy, a blanket. And that child gets to have those things. It's a small amount of comfort, but it's something when they have to leave everything else behind because we're pulling them out of the home. Community alliances can sponsor education and awareness events. They can help raise money for companion dogs for law enforcement officers, especially those officers who may be assigned very specifically to drug endangered children. We have communities across the United States that have a designated drug endangered child officer on their staff, and that child or that officer is the one that is at the home with that child and gets them out, and is the one that helps facilitate the process into foster care, and is the familiar face, the safe face. We have a school resource officer here in Richland County who all of the kids know him, and he is the one that gets called in. You know, if a car gets pulled over and they need to search everybody for drugs, the child in the car included, they will call that school resource officer in if they can get a hold of him and have him be the one to do the search on the child because the child knows them. So all ways to look at lessening the trauma of the situation. And these are all relatively new ideas in the last 10 or 15 years. Used to be, we just barreled into a home, did the drug raid, pull the kids out, take them to the hospital, get them checked over, throw them into a foster home and move on. We now know that these kids need to be attended to in terms of trauma, just in a different way than what perhaps the adults do. The vision, of course, is 100% healthy, safe kids and families and communities. We're not ever going to get there, but we can sure strive to get there. And taking into account what these kids go through is critical. It's a critical piece for their health. It's a critical piece for our community's health. I'm going to stop right there and leave you with my contact information. I am happy to take questions. You can reach out to me at any point. If you would like to explore the opportunity for a much lengthier, more in-depth training, this was taking a long period of training and condensing it into 1 hour. I'm always happy to talk about that. And I will tell you that my fees, everything is paid for through the SIU School of Medicine. So for me to come to your organization, it does not cost anything. They cover the fees for all of this. Is what I do. So make sure you've got that. And I'm going to ask you before you sign off or put questions in the chat to do the evaluation. Again, do the QR code on your smartphone and fill out that short evaluation, and it'll go directly where it needs to be. And I'll get to see those evaluations in the next couple of days. Zach, were there any questions that came up through the chat?
A couple. You answered them actually as you went. There were a couple of individuals who were asking if you were available to come to their location and do this webinar again.
Absolutely.
And again, her contact info is in there in the slides. I'm sure she can pull it back up again and take that down. And looks like we've got a question. I'm a social worker in a rural community. Do you have a presentation for teachers, like what to look for?
Yes and no, not a specific to teachers, but what I would recommend is reach out to me, and I would prefer to do the full training, and it can be anywhere from 2 to 6 hours, depending on what you guys are looking for, where we expand on these things a little bit. I also have, as I said, what we call live video footage, so that teachers especially can walk through the process of what happens when a home is barreled into necessarily by law enforcement. We also, and those videos are just, they're really important. They just take up too much time to be able to put it in a 1 hour presentation such as this. So the long answer for a short question is yes, we have more that we can do with this. I also will tell you that the school resource officer that I referenced here about 5 minutes ago, Brad Amater, and I typically co-teach the longer sessions like this. And if I can pull him away from his job duties with the school, and that's a 50-50 shot, we will come in and co-teach that. And he brings a whole more in-depth perspective for school personnel, but usually for school personnel, he'll make every effort to be able to make it to that training because his work is so directed to the schools. So yes.
One of the other questions I seem to see popping up quite a bit is there going to be certifications for this? Yes, there will be CEUs. They'll be sent out within the next 2 weeks, and we will email those to you. Your email will be sent to us, and we'll get it put out there. Another question for Liesl is, when we work with preschool children removed from drug homes, is there any ideas for servicing their needs?
I am so glad you asked that. I am a grandparent raising a grandchild. We took guardianship of our 2.5-year-old grandson for just this reason. He'll be 6 in January, doing very well. And I leaned very heavily on somebody named Dr. Jerry. Well, he's not a doctor. I call him a doctor, but it's Jerry Moe. He is the retired children's director from the Betty Ford Center, a counselor. And this is all he did in his career, was working with children living in drug endangered homes or dealing with parental addiction. He's written an excellent book that I have used as a resource. And I would encourage you to shoot me an email and throw that question out at me, and I will give you that information. The book is called Understanding Parental Addiction Through a Child's Eyes, written by Jerry Moe, M-O-E. It is amazing. I also would guide you to a website called sesamestreetincommunities.org. It's exactly like it sounds, sesamestreetincommunities.org. This is an organization that is a spinoff of Sesame Street. They run it, and it was created to address rough situations, various rough situations that our children deal with. And if you go on to that website, on the right-hand drop down, it'll say topics. You click that, and that drop down is going to bring out about 30 or 40 topics, one of which is parental addiction, I believe. But you click on that link, and there are all kinds of resources for kids of all ages. And I will tell you that Jerry, who is actually a personal friend, Nancy is very familiar with him also. Jerry was the primary consultant. Sesame Street invited him to do the consulting for the development of that part of the website. And it is amazing. I use it. I send it out to people all the time. It is amazing. Also, his book gives excellent language, ways to deal with these kiddos, things that he's done from his private practice. Just amazing. And I will tell you, if you ever have the chance to hear him speak, you need to jump on it. I know the state Prevent Child Abuse PCA conference is coming up in Naperville in October, and he is going to be one of the keynote speakers there. So that would be a conference that I would tell you to go to that and listen to him. But he is amazing. And that's been my primary counselor as we have dealt with our grandson. And I will tell you that our little guy is doing incredible. And he didn't have to experience the human trafficking piece of it, but the violence piece, the lack of resources, loss, all the frequent moving, all of those were part of his history before he was ever even old enough to speak. And when he came to us, he did not speak, he didn't sleep, he didn't eat. It was a mess. And now we have a happy, healthy 5.5-year-old little guy that is a joy to be around. So please reach out to me, and I can give you more information on those areas if you want it.
What was the name of Jerry Moe's book again?
It is called Understanding Parental Addiction Through a Child's Eyes. And I would try and show it to you on the screen, but I don't think it will show up. I've tried it before. Let me try again. I've got it right here. Can you see it? Yeah,
it's blurred out.
Right there. That's what it looks like. This needs to be on every teacher's reading list, quite frankly, and school administrator, anybody that works with children that are living in these situations. It is an excellent resource.
Can you rename the conference again in Naperville?
Prevent Child Abuse of Illinois. And if you Google that, you will bring up their state website. The executive director is Tara Winters. She is amazing. And they will have conference registration information on there. It is in Naperville. And Zachary, do you remember the dates for that conference?
I believe it's October 24th. 24th through the 26th, I believe. It's there towards the end of October.
Yeah, take a look at it. It will be an excellent conference. You'll get to hear Jerry speak.
Hannah asks if we put our own cities in. Yes, Hannah, we do put your own cities in into the survey. If there's any other questions, please put them in the comments here. I don't see any others so far. Do you have any other trainings coming up?
Well, yes, I do. I have several coming up. I will be down in Metropolis. I will be doing a training in Anna. These will be longer trainings. I'm speaking at the Illinois Probation and Court Service Association State Conference in October, and we'll be doing a several-hour training through them. I have a couple of other online private organizational trainings coming up. Reach out to me and I can try and hook you up. Right now, I think this is the one that's the most public. I will also be speaking in Marion, Illinois it's a judicial conference. But that one's not until March of 24. And those are just the ones off the top of my head. But if you would like for me, if you want to talk about my coming to your school, we can do a teacher in service. We could do a staff meeting. There's a lot of different options here. We can do it virtual. I can do it in person. It just depends on what you want, what you need. Please reach out to me. I am happy to get this information out.
All righty. I think that finishes up the questions. Thank you very much, Liesl, for the webinar. We had several on here that said thank you, and it was a huge help to them. There will be a survey here once you guys are logging off. Please fill that out for us. And again, if you go to IllinoisFamilyResources.org, you can sign up for our newsletter. You can go to our Facebook page and like us. For the deck training eval, it would be the DEC training is the one that you use. I saw that question come by.
It'll be, yeah, it's considered the core deck training.
Yep.
I believe.
Looks like that is all the questions that we have. We got one more asking about the name of the book again.
It is called Understanding Parental Addiction Through a Child's Eyes.
All righty. If that's all the questions, again, thank you all for coming. Had a wonderful webinar here, and we will see you all again. If you have any other questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to Liesl. Her info's here on the screen, and thank you all again for coming.